think would win in a fight? The Amazons or the Atlanteans? If there's one group of people out there who's given this question serious thought, then it has to be comic book fans, right? After all, the Amazons and the Atlanteans have inspired some of the most popular comic book characters of all time. Wonder Woman, who is arguably the most consequential female superhero in the history of comic books, is famously an Amazon. In some versions of her comic continuity, she's the daughter of the mythical Queen Hippolyta. The lost city of Atlantis figures prominently in both the Marvel and DC universes. Marvel's Namor the Submariner and DC's Aquaman are both Atlantean royalty in their respective comic book worlds. And sure enough, in the DC comic book universe, there have been a number of storylines that have pit Wonder Woman's Amazons against Aquaman's Atlanteans. A quick Google search will direct you to a number of blog posts and a fairly vibrant Reddit thread where fans debate who would win in a one-on-one fight, Wonder Woman or Aquaman. The consensus appears to be that Wonder Woman has the edge, unless, of course, the fight was moved into the ocean, at which point all bets are off. Now, this may sound like a completely frivolous question that would only concern people who are deeply invested in the DCU. But believe it or not, one ancient historian can tell us exactly what would happen if the Amazons and the Atlanteans went to war. Yes, if you consult the work of Diodorus of Sicily, a Greek Sicilian historian who lived during the 1st century BC, you will find an account of the Amazon-Atlantean War. The account appears in a giant work known as the Bibliotheca Historia, or the Library of History. Many experts have pointed out that the title of this monumental piece of ancient history suggests that Diodorus's project was primarily a compilation of earlier work. His Library of History was meant to be a compendium of all historical knowledge, or at least what was considered the entirety of historical knowledge in the Mediterranean world in the 1st century BC. This ranged from the deep mythic past right up to the life and times of Alexander the Great. In Volume 2, Book 3 of the Bibliotheca, Diodorus leads his reader through the history of the Amazons. Now, interestingly, Diodorus's account of the Amazons differs significantly from some of the better-known traditions about this group of female warriors. First, he claims that the original Amazon homeland was in Libya, which at the time was an imprecise geographic term that could refer to any number of places in Africa. Most of the famous stories about the Amazons placed their homeland on the southern shore of the Black Sea. So Diodorus's claim that they were, in fact, a North African people is notable. He also claims that while the Amazons were certainly a female-led culture, there were also male Amazons. Diodorus writes, quote, "The men, like our married women, spent their days about the house, carrying out the orders which were given to them by their wives, and they took no part in military campaigns, or in office, or in the exercise of free citizenship." End quote. So, in Diodorus's estimation, the Amazons were not an exclusively female society. Men weren't cast out of Amazon society. Instead, the gender roles were flipped, or would have appeared flipped from the perspective of the ancient Greeks. Most importantly, the Amazons were warlike. The historian explains, quote, "The Amazons embarked upon great ventures, a longing having come over them to invade many parts of the inhabited world." End quote. Diodorus then tells us that, quote, "The first people against whom they advanced, according to the tale, were the Atlanteans, the most civilized men among the inhabitants of those regions, who dwelt in a prosperous country and possessed great cities." End quote. Now, when I first came across this passage, my head nearly exploded. Back in season 2 of this podcast, I spent 3 episodes exploring the lore associated with the lost city of Atlantis. And during that process, I didn't come across a single mention of Diodorus' story of an Amazon invasion. In fact, in that series, I made a big point of the fact that the only source for the Atlantis story is in the writing of the famous Greek philosopher Plato. So, imagine my surprise when I'm reading some Diodorus hunting for tales of Amazons, and then boom, there's a big fat reference to Atlantis being one of the Amazon's great enemies. Once again, I found myself thinking, why isn't everyone talking about this? The Amazons and the Atlanteans went to war? Come on! This is St. Patrick killing wizards all over again. This should be on the marquee. Okay, but part of the reason that Diodorus' account of Atlantis may have escaped the notice of the Atlantis hunters I was reading back in season 2 is that his account differs so radically from what appears in Plato. The Atlantis described by Diodorus isn't an island nation, distinguished by one unique circular city ringed by sophisticated canals. On the contrary, Diodorus' Atlantis is an unremarkable region in northern Africa that is home to a number of cities. His Atlantis was not destroyed by a series of natural disasters which sunk the nation to the bottom of the sea. Instead, it was invaded by the Amazons. In fact, beyond sharing the name Atlantis, the Atlantis described by Plato has virtually nothing in common with the Atlantis described by Diodorus. In Diodorus' account, the Atlanteans would never get a chance to wage a war with the Athenians or offend the gods with their hubris, because they were conquered so early in their history by the Amazons. In the Bibliotheca, Diodorus explains that the Amazons were commanded by a great queen named Myrina, who made it her life's work to expand the Amazon Empire. If we believe Diodorus, then the neighboring Atlanteans were barely a match for her impressive army. He describes the Amazon force as, quote, an army of 30,000 foot soldiers and 3,000 cavalry, since they favored to an unusual degree the use of cavalry in their wars. For protective devices, they used the skins of large snakes, since Libya contained such animals of incredible size. For offensive weapons, swords and lances. They also used bows and arrows, which they struck not only when facing the enemy, but also when in flight, by shooting backwards at their pursuers with good effect. End quote. I love those details. Diodorus' Amazons used snakeskin armor, which, come on, that's pretty badass. He also mentions that they were excellent equestrians who could even fire arrows backwards while on horseback, a popular maneuver used by steppe horse archers for centuries, sometimes called the Parthian shot. According to Diodorus, the war was not long. He explains, quote, upon entering the land of the Atlanteans, they defeated in a pitched battle the inhabitants of the city of Cyrene. Desiring to strike terror into the neighboring peoples, they treated the captives savagely, put to the sword the men from youth upward. They led into slavery the children and women, and razed the city. But when the terrible fate of the inhabitants of Cyrene became known among their fellow tribesmen, it is related that the Atlanteans, struck with terror, surrendered their cities on terms of capitulation and announced that they would do whatever should be commanded of them. End quote. One battle and one sacked city later, and the Atlanteans were the subjects of the Amazons. So, the next time you hear someone spouting some trash about how the Atlanteans had super advanced technology, or that Atlantean refugees taught the Egyptians and the Mayans how to build pyramids. Just remind them that in every known tradition, the Atlanteans are losers. In Plato, they are defeated in battle by the Athenians. And in Diodorus, they are conquered and made the vassals of the Amazons. I know this might be controversial, and I might take some heat for this, but you know what? I'm going to say it. Friends, Atlantis sucks. In part 1 of this series, I made the point that both Atlantis and the Amazons have their own kind of fake history gravitational pull. But here we are, at the spot where those two worlds collide. The roads that lead to Atlantis and the roads that lead to the Amazons intersect right here. And since, according to Diodorus, the Amazons won their war with the Atlanteans, perhaps the Amazons should eclipse the Atlanteans as the fake history North Star of this podcast. Atlantis is dead. Long live the Amazons. But of course, this war described by Diodorus probably never happened. The assertion that the Amazons carved out an empire in North Africa is completely inconsistent with what every other ancient author says about this legendary group of warrior women. The inconsistencies in the sources can make it difficult for an investigator who's trying to determine whether or not the Amazons could have been based on a real ancient society. Diodorus was not the only ancient historian who believed that the Amazons were real. Writers like Herodotus, Plutarch, and Strabo all discussed the Amazons. However, the question of where they lived and how long their society survived was a matter of some debate, even in ancient times. Strabo, in particular, was skeptical of many of the best-known stories about this group of warrior women. Do all these conflicting accounts undermine the reality of the Amazons? Is there inconsistency in the sources because these women only ever truly existed in myth? Well, some have argued that these inconsistencies should not deter us in our hunt for real Amazons. While these ancient sources are hardly perfect, they may contain important clues that can guide us towards an authentic ancient culture, which may have been the basis for the Amazon myth. Those clues, paired with some fascinating archaeological finds, may indeed point us toward a group of ancient warrior women living on the periphery of the Greek world. Will this road truly lead us to real Amazons? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 162, Real Amazons, Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone that you can listen to an ad-free version of this podcast at patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Pledge at $5 or more every month to get access to an ad-free feed and every other extra that's currently on offer, including the latest patrons-only episode on the legendary Golden City of El Dorado. This week, we are wrapping up our series on the Society of Warrior Women known as the Amazons. This is part 2 in a 2-part series, so if you've not listened to part 1, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give that a listen now. In part 1, I introduced the topic by exploring the curious story of how the Amazon River was so named. Then we dove into some of the best-known Greek myths that feature the Amazon warriors. In my examination of those stories, I did my best to bring in commentary from experts who've written about the somewhat contradictory place the Amazons hold in Greek myth. On the one hand, they seem to represent a perversion of the Greek patriarchal ideal. Their female-led society could be understood as an affront to the ancient Greek idea of masculine order. The Amazons can sometimes be presented as grotesque or monstrous in their rejection of what the Greeks would have considered proper gender roles. To this day, the term Amazon can be used as an insult, often lobbed cruelly at women who are perceived as being too athletic, too powerful, or even just too tall. But as many of the experts I quoted have pointed out, the Amazons of Greek myth are not always presented in a wholly negative light. In fact, Amazons are often presented as being the heroic equals of the male heroes they are usually pitted against. Their queens are usually presented as reasonable, persuasive diplomats, not to mention incredibly effective war leaders. Their society is well ordered in many of these stories, and quite functional. On top of that, the Amazons are usually described as physically beautiful and highly desirable to the male heroes. Most of the best-known stories featuring the Amazons involve a Greek hero falling in love with, or at least lusting after, an Amazon queen. This was certainly the case in the stories featuring Heracles and Theseus that we looked at in the last episode. Art historian Andrew Stewart summed it up nicely when he wrote, quote, "Far from simply reinforcing the cliché of the craven barbarian and the heroic Greek victor, Amazons help question and problematize it," end quote. Now, one story that I didn't get around to telling in the last episode is the tale of Penthesilea and Achilles. Some of you may have found that strange, because after the story of Heracles and Hippolyta, it may be one of the best-known Amazon tales. Now, part of the reason I didn't dive more deeply into that story is because I've told it before on this podcast. Last season, when I was looking at the medieval queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, I explored the much-repeated story that she and her ladies-in-waiting dressed as Amazons when they went on crusade. This bit of Amazonian cosplay was allegedly done in imitation of the mythical queen Penthesilea, who was believed to have fought alongside the Trojans during the Trojan War. As you might remember, in this tradition, the Amazons were said to have been the allies of King Priam of Troy. After the death of his son, the great warrior Hector, Priam called on the Amazons in a renewed effort to fight off the besieging Greeks. Penthesilea and her company of mounted female warriors answered the call, and when they arrived on the battlefield, they more than lived up to their reputation as formidable soldiers. Now, if you want to hear this story in even more detail, then check out the cold open from episode 143. But what I want to highlight right now is how well this story fits in with all the other Amazon tales we've heard so far in this series. You see, the story comes to a climax when the very nearly invincible hero Achilles takes to the field in an attempt to blunt the Amazon attack. Eventually, he finds Penthesilea in the fray, and the two engage in single combat. Despite Penthesilea's awesome skill in battle, Achilles ultimately overcomes and kills the Amazon queen. But as the queen slumped over on the battlefield and the last life left her eyes, Achilles fell in love. In that moment, he realized that not only was she beautiful, but she may have been his one true equal on this earth. This scene was a favorite of Greek vase artists who used the image of Achilles grieving over the freshly slain Penthesilea as the ultimate expression of tragic romance. Hopefully, you can see how this story fits perfectly with the Heracles and Theseus myths we looked at last time. In all three of these stories, we have a mighty Greek hero falling in love with, but ultimately killing, an Amazon queen. The Amazons in all three of these stories are presented as beautiful, admirable, and the heroic equals of their male counterparts. And yet, in all these stories, they end up murdered by the very men who find them so desirable. The Greek heroes are conflicted when confronted by the Amazons. On the one hand, they are barbaric adversaries that must be destroyed. On the other, they're noble beauties who they can't help but admire. The death of Penthesilea was given even more weight by the historian we heard from in the introduction, Diodorus of Sicily. He treated it as an authentic historical event. Not only was her death a tragedy, but in his estimation, it marked the end of Amazon society. The last Amazon warriors, according to Diodorus, were wiped out in the Trojan War. The death of Penthesilea truly marked the end of an era. But other ancient historians weren't so sure. Some believed that Amazon culture persisted for centuries after the Trojan War was believed to have been fought. In fact, some ancient historians believed that the Amazons may have been encountered by some of antiquity's most storied generals, including Alexander the Great. So let's dive into the writing of some of these ancient historians and explore what they can tell us about the Amazons. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Indeed. When it comes to hiring, you need to trust your gut. But what if you could give your gut some help? When you want to find top talent fast, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Find top talent fast with Indeed's suite of powerful hiring tools like Indeed Instant Match, assessments, and virtual interviews. One thing that I think is great about Indeed is that it does the hard work for you. Sponsor a job and boom, Instant Match shows you candidates whose resumes on Indeed fit your job description immediately after you post. Indeed knows that when you're doing everything for your company, you can't afford to overspend on hiring. Visit Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory to start hiring right now. Just go to Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory. Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. When looking at ancient Mediterranean historians, you really need to begin with the granddaddy of them all, your friend and mine, father of history, father of lies, Herodotus. Around the year 430 BC, Herodotus, a Greek scholar from the ancient city of Halicarnassus, completed his groundbreaking work known as the Histories. This is widely considered to be the first work of history in what would become the Western tradition. But unless this is your first episode of Our Fake History, then you already know that. I know, I say something like this every time Herodotus appears on the show, but I think it's kind of amazing that what is ostensibly the first proper work of history is famous for being shot through with myth, rumor, exaggeration, and the storytelling flourishes of a man who is just as much a bard as he was a scholar. From the very beginning, our history was our fake history. Because Herodotus never misses a chance to relate a juicy story, there's obviously a section in the histories that deals with the Amazons. But interestingly, Herodotus gives us a somewhat different history for the Amazons than what we get from the traditional myths and what would later appear in the work of Diodorus of Sicily. First, it should be noted that Herodotus relates his history of the Amazons in the context of a larger discussion of the tribes of Scythia. As I mentioned in the last episode, there were a number of traditions that connected the Amazons to these nomadic horse archer people who roamed Central Asia. Herodotus explains that the Greeks and the Amazons at one point went to war. Now, it's not clear if this is a reference to the Attic War, the mythical Amazon assault on Athens we discussed in the last episode, because his account of the conflict ends with the Greeks bringing the war to the Amazons. Herodotus claims that the Greek forces won a decisive victory in a battle fought near the Thermodon River, south of the Black Sea. The victorious Greeks rounded up as many Amazons as they could find after the battle and loaded them onto their ships to be made slaves. But, and this is where the story gets good, Herodotus tells us that the fiercely independent Amazons were not about to be made into anyone's slaves, and so they staged a mutiny while they were at sea. Herodotus writes, quote, "These women upon the voyage rose up against the crews and massacred them to a man." End quote. But for all their skill, the Amazons were not sailors. With all the Greeks dead, they had no way to control the ships, and so they drifted until they eventually hit shore. When they were finally able to disembark, the Amazons were now on the north shore of the Black Sea, near what is today called the Don River. This was the land of the Scythians. Herodotus tells us that the Amazons wasted no time in stealing horses, raiding camps, and generally causing havoc. Every time the Scythians rode out to fight the Amazons, the warrior women beat them back. So, Herodotus explains, the Scythians chose a different tactic. They created a brigade of young men whose job would be to tempt the Amazons with their youthful good looks. The company would ride out near the Amazons, but if the women should attack, they would retreat. Then they would make their camp as near to the Amazon camp as they possibly could without provoking a fresh attack. Eventually, the Amazons realized that these young guys weren't going to fight them. Slowly but surely, the two camps moved closer and closer together. One day, an Amazon and a Scythian met on common ground. Herodotus writes, quote, "The man easily gained the good graces of the woman, who bade him by signs, for they did not understand each other's language, to bring a friend the next day to the spot where they had met, promising on her part to bring with her another woman. He did so, and the woman kept her word. When the rest of the youths heard what was taking place, they also sought and gained the favor of the other Amazons. The two camps were joined in one, the Scythians living with the Amazons as their wives." End quote. So according to Herodotus, after a bit of a mating dance, the two groups came together. But the Amazons weren't really into the idea of being absorbed into Scythian society. Herodotus even gives us a direct quote from an unnamed Amazon who tells her Scythian husband, quote, "We could not live with your women. Our customs are quite different from theirs. To draw the bow, to hurl the javelin, to bestride the horse, these are our arts. Your women, on the contrary, do none of these things, but stay at home in their wagons, engaged in womanish tasks, and never go out to hunt or to do anything. We should never agree together. But if you truly wish to keep us as your wives, and would conduct yourselves with strict justice towards us, go home to your parents, bid them give you your inheritance, and then come back to us, and let us and you live together by ourselves." End quote. And once again, this is pretty badass, especially by ancient standards. Herodotus tells us that the Amazons were simply not going to accept the limited gender roles of typical Scythian society. So they told their new husbands to go home, get their inheritance, and come back only if they were ready to have wives that they were going to treat as equals. Now, to their credit, the Scythian husbands did exactly that. Herodotus tells us that they went home, collected whatever wealth they believed was owed to them, and then bid adieu to the Scythians. From there, the Amazon-Scythian couples headed northeast, deeper into the Eurasian continent. There, they settled and steadily transformed into a wholly new group of people that Herodotus identifies as the Sauromatai, also known as the Sarmatians. Now, the Sarmatians were a real group of nomadic horse archers who lived on the eastern edges of what is today Iran. So if we trust Herodotus, over time, the Amazon-Scythian breakaway group simply became the Sarmatians. In my mind, it's kind of like how the very exotic-seeming dinosaurs eventually evolved into more familiar-looking birds. In part 1 of this series, I related a story where the Amazons described themselves as a breakaway Scythian group. In Herodotus, they are a distinct group that later combines with the Scythians. What's interesting here is that Herodotus truly seems to be bridging a gap between myth and history. For him, the Amazons were a real historical people whose unique culture faded away as it evolved into Sarmatian culture. This idea that the Amazons were absorbed into the nomadic societies of the steppe is echoed again in a much later story featuring Alexander the Great. This story was related by a few of Alexander's biographers, but was later taken up with gusto in the largely fictitious Alexander romances that became very popular in the medieval era. The story goes that after the famous Battle of Gaugamela, where Alexander defeated the Persian king Darius III, Alexander set about bringing many of the nomadic people who had once paid homage to the Persians into the fold of his new empire. It was at this time that a company of Amazons arrived from the steppe, eager to meet the new conqueror. The Amazon company was led by a formidable queen named Thalestris. We're told that Thalestris had an intriguing offer for Alexander. Alexander's genius on the battlefield had impressed the Amazon, and so she decided that he was worthy enough to be the father of her children. She told Alexander that she was the best of women, and so together they could breed a race of children that would surely dominate the world. Intrigued, Alexander agreed to do his part to help Thalestris conceive. Legend has it that they spent 13 days and 13 nights together before Thalestris was convinced that she had become pregnant. The Amazon then bid Alexander goodbye and rode off back to her homeland, presumably to have the world's most impressive child. Thalestris and her Amazons were then never mentioned again in the sources. Now, this story even made the ancient historians skeptical. The Roman-era Greek historian Plutarch, who's come up on this series already, found this story to be pretty dubious. Modern researchers really appreciate Plutarch as an ancient source, by the way, because he's really careful about listing his sources. In Plutarch's estimation, all the most trustworthy sources that he was working from thought this story was little more than a fable. Plutarch also points to a letter written by Alexander to one of his generals that discussed this period when he was tangling with various nomadic groups. In that letter, he says nothing about a fortnight of Amazon sex, but he does mention that a Scythian king had offered to wed his daughter to him. Plutarch suggests that the whole Thalestris story may have grown out of this seed of truth, that Alexander at one point was offered a Scythian bride. Plutarch also tells us that years after Alexander's death, the Thalestris story was read to King Lysimachus, one of Alexander's commanders and closest companions. After hearing the story, Lysimachus apparently smiled and said, quote, "And where was I then?" End quote. You see, writers like Plutarch were quite comfortable with the Amazons living in the very distant past alongside heroes like Theseus. But the idea that the Amazons were still around at the time of Alexander was harder for them to believe. The Roman geographer Strabo expressed similar feelings about the Amazons. In his monumental work on the geography of the known world, Strabo felt obligated to speak about the Amazon homeland as a real place. He situated it at the base of the Caucasus Mountains near the Black Sea. His work also included many of the classic legends about the Amazons, including the story that they destroyed their right breasts so that they might better wield their weapons. He also repeats the story of how the Amazons have a yearly tryst with a neighboring tribe he calls the Gargarians. The female children were kept, and the males were returned to be raised by the fathers. Strabo was clearly willing to accept that there was an Amazon homeland, but he expresses doubt that all the stories about the Amazons are true. He calls their history, quote, peculiar, and writes, quote, "Who can believe that an army of women, or a city, or a nation could ever subsist without men, and not only subsist, but make inroads upon the territory of other people?" End quote. Now, what's interesting here is that Strabo's skepticism is founded entirely on the fact that he doesn't think that women could be warriors or could effectively lead a nation without men. Now, unless I'm reading him wrong, his doubts about the Amazons seem to be less about the reliability of his sources and more about the prejudices he has about women. You see, there are many good reasons to be skeptical about the Amazons, but the idea that women can't fight is certainly not one of them. Strabo may have found the idea laughable, but we know now that female warriors were not unheard of in ancient Central Asia. This brings us to the work of Adrian Mayer, Stanford professor and the author of The Amazons: Lives and Legends of Warrior Women Across the Ancient World. In that book, Mayer makes the claim that archaeological finds have proven that female warriors were quite common in ancient Scythian and Sarmatian society. Furthermore, she asserts that these warrior women could be understood as the, quote, historical Amazons. So, how seriously should we take these claims? Well, let's take a quick break, and when we return, we'll get into the debate that surrounds Mayer's work on the Amazons. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. While you're hearing my voice, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now. getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you can save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. If you've been listening to Our Fake History for a while, then you should already be familiar with the name Adrienne Mayor. Last season, I did a standalone episode called Real Griffins, where I explored the professor's belief that mythical griffins had been inspired by ancient Scythian gold hunters' encounters with fossilized dinosaur remains in the desert regions around the Altai Mountains. If you listen back to that episode, I think you can hear just how taken I was with that particular theory. Now, near the end of that episode, I did my best to present some criticisms of Mayer's idea. I found a few, but none were particularly damning, so I concluded that Mayer's thesis that the images of griffins in Scythian art were an early form of paleo art was certainly worth considering. And then I hedged my bets by saying that this theory was far from proven, and that if you're interested in that particular topic, you should look deeper into what relevant classicists and paleontologists have to say about the issue. But now, I think that I may have gone a little easy on Adrienne Mayor back in episode 145. Because in my research for this series, I have come across some far more robust criticisms of her work. Why is this relevant? Well, Adrienne Mayor's 2016 book, The Amazons: Lives and Legends of Warrior Women Across the Ancient World, is one of the most widely available and best read books that deals with the question of whether or not there were real women who inspired the Amazons of Greek myth. In that book, Mayor makes the case that there were indeed historical Amazons. In his review of Mayer's book, University of Saskatchewan historian John Porter summarized her thesis like this, quote, "From around 700 BC to around AD 500, there flourished a group of related cultures, the Sacassithians, Thracians, and Sarmatians, that stretched roughly from modern Bulgaria through Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine on to southwest Russia and Kazakhstan. These were nomadic peoples who shared a migratory life centered on horses, archery, hunting, herding, trading, raiding, and guerrilla-style warfare, whose presence is marked in the archaeological record by a common material culture, the so-called Scythian triad of distinctive weapons, horses, and artistic animal-style motifs, all of which are attested in burials from the Carpathian Mountains to northern China. Most strikingly, these societies were characterized by a high level of equality between men and women, since, due to the equalizing combination of horseback riding and archery, which allowed women to be as fast and deadly as men, women were accorded an important role in warfare and other activities that in most of Greece would have been gendered as male. In Scythian society, as opposed to most Greek city-states, women could be hunters and warriors without giving up femininity, male companionship, sex, and motherhood." End quote. Mayor argues that the Amazons that appear in both Greek myth and the writings of the ancient historians like Herodotus and Diodorus were imperfect reflections of a very real Amazon-like society that existed on the Eurasian steppe. To make this point, Mayer points to traditions found in both myth and the writings of ancient historians that connect the Amazons to the Scythians. Now, in this series, I've tried to highlight those particular moments. In the myth of the Attic War, the Amazons win their Scythian allies by explaining that they had once been Scythians. As we just saw in Herodotus, the Amazons and a group of Scythian men were reported to be the parents of the Sarmatian people. Mayer also points out that many descriptions of Amazon life are strikingly similar to what we know about the lifestyle of the Scythians and other similar steppe nomadic groups. The Amazons were consistently described as great horsewomen. Mayer also argues that in Greek art, particularly on vase paintings, the Amazons were depicted wearing clothes commonly associated with the Scythians. The Scythians were known to wear a very distinctive conical hat. Kind of looks like a Smurf hat. Well, in her book, Mayer points to a number of examples in ancient Greek art where Amazons are pictured wearing these Scythian-style hats. Now, this could have been a visual motif used simply to identify the Amazons as Eastern barbarians, but Mayer argues that these images, paired with all the other connections to the Scythians found in both myth and in ancient historical writing, suggest that the Amazons were based on real Scythian warrior women. Furthermore, there have been some important archaeological finds that Mayer says support her argument that Thracian, Scythian, and Sarmatian warrior women should be considered the quote-unquote historical Amazons. In particular, she points to the work of archaeologists Renata Rolla, Elena Fialco, and Eileen Murphy. Their research has demonstrated that some women from the Eurasian steppe appear to have been buried as warriors. One of Renata Rolla's studies cited by Mayer suggested that armed females represented as many as 37% of the discovered Scythian burials. The largest number of female warrior graves have been found around the northern Black Sea. The graves of these female warriors were exactly the same as the graves of male warriors, which meant that some early archaeologists sometimes misidentified these graves as belonging to male warriors. But thanks to more modern techniques, we can now determine the biological sex of the deceased person based on their skeleton. Now, Mayer begins her chapter on these suggestive archaeological finds by describing one especially provocative 4th century BC Scythian gravesite that was discovered in southern Ukraine. She writes, quote, "Wounds from a battle axe in the skull and a bent bronze arrowhead embedded in the knee. Obviously, this warrior had died in battle. 2 iron lances were plunged into the ground at the grave's entrance, and 2 more spears lay beside the skeleton inside. A massive armored leather belt with iron plaques lay next to a quiver and 20 bronze-tipped arrows with red-striped wooden shafts. Other grave goods included glass beads, pearls, bracelets of silver and bronze, a bronze mirror, a lead spindle whorl, a needle, an iron knife, and a wooden tray of food. A typical Scythian warrior's grave of the 4th century BC, except that this particular warrior was a young woman." End quote. Now, it's worth noting that this particular gravesite provides some of the most vivid evidence for the existence of female warriors in Scythian society. Mayer begins her chapter describing this particular gravesite because it's the least ambiguous and most obvious final resting place of a warrior woman. But we need to ask, how common are grave sites like this? Well, Mayer points out that of the over 1,000 Scythian and Sarmatian grave sites that have been excavated by archaeologists, armed women have been found in over a quarter of them. But does being buried with weapons always mean you were a warrior? Well, not necessarily. Weaponry can often be ceremonial in nature. There are examples from cultures around the world where royalty or members of a priesthood or other non-combatants might be buried with ceremonial swords, axes, bows, and other weapons of war. We should ask, is that what's happening here? Well, potentially. But Mayer argues that some of these female skeletons had evidence of wounds that she insists were received during battle. To reinforce this, she cites a study published by Ex Jordana and a group of other archaeologists. Mayer points out that this study demonstrated that some of the remains still had pieces of bronze arrowheads lodged in their bones. Other bones had clearly been hacked or slashed by swords or axes. The study demonstrated that many of the skeletons belonging to both men and women had suffered blows to the head from battle axes wielded by right-handed opponents. Another very common injury found on these remains are what are called nightstick fractures of the left forearm bone. This is an injury common to people who have broken the bone by using their left forearm to block an attack from a club or a sword. I'm only pointing out that it's the left arm because that was the arm where people typically carried a shield. Mayer's analysis of these archaeological findings is that they quite clearly demonstrate that women fought alongside men in Scythian society. In fact, she feels confident in concluding that as many as a quarter of the mounted warriors in a Scythian army may have been female. She sums up by writing, quote, "The archaeological record proves beyond a doubt that hunter-warrior horsewomen were a historical reality across a great expanse of geography and chronology from the western Black Sea to northern China for more than 1,000 years." End quote. It's Mayer's belief that these Scythian warrior women, attested to by these excavated grave sites, were surely encountered by the ancient Greeks and were then represented as Amazons in their art and mythology. Now, to her credit, Adrienne Mayer is a very persuasive writer, so it can be easy to be carried along by her brisk prose and accessible presentation of complex archaeological data. But the more I researched this particular topic, the more skeptical I became of Professor Mayer's conclusions. It turns out that many classicists have serious issues with Adrienne Mayer's work. Her book on the Amazons has drawn particularly robust criticism. One of the most thorough responses that I came across was written by historian and classicist John Porter of the University of Saskatchewan. I quoted him earlier. Porter's 2020 review of The Amazons is over 100 pages long and is less a review than it is a careful rebuttal of almost everything in the book. Now, he felt compelled to do this because he feels that most academic reviews of her books, while critical, are so polite that the average reader might not realize how serious the flaws in the books truly are. He explains, quote, "No one to date has engaged in serious detail with the inadequacies of Mayer's text. However, while the understated and coded language of dismissal, typical of the standard scholarly review, is unlikely to convey to enthusiasts just how problematic a text this is." End quote. Now, I found that really interesting because I think I may have been one of those enthusiasts who didn't pick up on the coded language of dismissal that may have appeared in reviews of Mayer's other books. Now, obviously, we do not have time to go through all of John Porter's points here, but I will link to his review at ourfakehistory.com. Just click on the page for this particular episode and you'll see it in the works cited section. But I do want to highlight a few of his big criticisms. So let's get into it. The points made by Porter that I found the most compelling had to do with the archaeological evidence used by Mayer. Porter argues that Mayer has either misunderstood or is purposely misrepresenting the findings of the archaeologists that she cites in her work. Specifically, he points out that Mayer is quick to call many of the female skeletons found with weaponry and with supposed battle wounds, quote, woman warriors. However, the archaeologists she cites don't go that far. In their opinion, the remains may have been those of non-combatants who were attacked and forced to defend themselves. The archaeologist X. Jordana and his team write, quote, the location and distribution of violent wounds on the body of these individuals appear to originate from all directions, indicating that fighting took place in a fashion that resulted in a randomly dispersed injury pattern. According to several authors, skeletal trauma that is randomly distributed may suggest conflicts related to the defense of communal property or ambush or surprise attacks, and not as a result of routinized or ritualized violence. Victims of attacks in these groups can include individuals of all ages and both sexes. End quote. It's worth noting that some of the skeletons analyzed in that study were those of children. While they also had wounds on their bodies inflicted by edged weapons, it might be a bit of a stretch to call them children warriors. In her book, Mayer makes it sound like there's a strong consensus among archaeologists that warrior women were quite common across the Eurasian steppe for a solid millennium. In the passage I quoted earlier, she says that the archaeological evidence made this, quote, beyond a doubt, end quote. But Porter points out that assertion really is not accurate. In fact, there is quite a lot of debate around just how common female warriors were in Scythian and Sarmatian society. Porter points to the work of the Russian archaeologist A.I. Ivanchik. Ivanchik has been far more conservative when determining whether or not a gravesite truly belongs to a female warrior. He's made the point that some female Scythian skeletons were sometimes eagerly designated quote-unquote armed women, even though only a single arrowhead was found in connection with their burial. Citing the work of yet another Russian archaeologist, Ivanchik has pointed out that of the 4,500 Scythian graves excavated in both the steppes proper and in an area known as the forested steppes, only some 112 female burials included weapons. That's only 2.5%. Ivanchik summed up his 2013 analysis by saying, quote, women warriors among the Scythians and Sarmatians clearly represented a rare exception, end quote. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that there is no evidence of female warriors in ancient Scythian and Sarmatian societies. There is some, but it doesn't appear to be as overwhelming as Adrienne Mayer makes it seem in her book. Porter is right to criticize her for not accurately presenting where archaeologists are at with this. The question of how common female warriors were on the steppe in different ethnic groups at different times is still hotly debated among archaeologists. The fact that Mayer breezes past this isn't really a good look. But even if the archaeological evidence for Scythian warrior women was as compelling as Mayer claims it is, would it still be reasonable to call those women historical Amazons? You need to ask, how close would those women need to be to the Amazons of myth for that comparison to hold water? Are these Scythian graves found in the traditional Amazon homeland? Well, kinda, but not really. The Amazons of myth came from the mouth of the Thermodon River. That's the south bank of the Black Sea, or northern Anatolia. All the compelling warrior women grave sites come from the north shore of the Black Sea, near the Dniester River. Now, to be fair, You might remember that Herodotus is the one person who places the Amazons north of the Black Sea. But he's a bit of an outlier. Did the Scythians have a female-dominated society like the Amazons, or were they matriarchal in any way? Well, the evidence doesn't really suggest that. Scythian leaders seem to have been overwhelmingly male. Now, there is evidence that gender roles in Scythian society were not as rigid as ancient Greek society. As in many nomadic societies, the division of labor between men and women was less strict. Women were known to hunt and men were known to cook. But does a society with more gender equality than the ancient Greeks make it a clear real-life parallel for the Amazons? Maybe, but I think you have to squint pretty hard at Scythian gender dynamics to see a society where there are no men at all. Did Scythian women mutilate their breasts so, like the mythical Amazons, they might more effectively wield their weapons of war? Definitely not. There is clearly a connection between the Scythian nomads and the Amazons in mythology and in the writings of ancient historians, especially Herodotus. But does that mean that Scythian warrior women were real Amazons? Sorry, Adrian Mayer, but I really can't go with you that far. Based on my reading, it seems like the archaeological community is still cautious when it comes to evidence of warrior women in ancient Scythian and Sarmatian society. It does seem like there were some female warriors among the Scythians, but it's still unclear how common they were. Were they common enough to inspire a mythic tradition as robust as the one you find about the Amazons? Yeah, that is deeply unclear. For his part, John Porter is totally unconvinced. He writes, quote, "Labeling alleged warrior women of the Eurasian steppe and beyond as Amazons is inane, and while it might attract a readership, distorts our sense of each. The most essential feature of the early Greek Amazon is that she somehow lived in a society without men. The lengths to which Mayer must go to efface or ignore this fact indicates just how little interest she really has in this mythical creature. The fact that she can apply the term Amazon to women of the Eurasian steppe demonstrates the severely limited nature of her understanding of the term historical." End quote. Whoo! I mean, that might be harsh, but I have to agree with John Porter on this one. So, were there real Amazons? I think I have to say no. Adrian Mayer makes an interesting case, but as Porter and others have pointed out, her book has a number of serious flaws. Professor Mayer tries to draw a neat line from the warrior women of the steppe to the mythical Amazons, but I'm not convinced that neat line can be drawn. At least, not yet. With all that said, I'm willing to leave the door open a crack on this one, because I think it's fascinating that so many ancient historians took the reality of the Amazons for granted. The fact that there are so many ancient traditions connecting the Amazons ethnically with the Scythians is also pretty interesting. But that's not quite enough to be able to say, yes, there were historical Amazons. As we learn more, that might change. But even if the Amazons were a purely mythical people, they still kicked Atlantis hard in the butt. And that makes them pretty cool in my book. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. Before we go this week, I need to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to NE Custom Wood Frames, to Astacia, to Sarah Clark, to Gregory Blick, to Josh Cornelius, to Robbie Marshall, to Steve Texiera, hope I said that right, Steve, to Will Kieltick, to my man Carter Thrower, to Matt Yoder, to Philip Rice, to Savannah Mural, to Nate Claxton, to Eli Labadi, to Leah Rogers, to Derek Herman, to Dom Goyette, to Putter Clayman, to Suleiman Najai, to Herc, and finally to Austin Dries McAdoo and his lovely wife, Lincoln. All of these people have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you so much for your support. If you think you also want to support this show and get a shout out at the end, go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Look at a level of support that works for you. If you want to support the show and you don't got extra money because times are tough, then maybe just go write a nice review somewhere. Give us 5 stars and say some nice things. Nice reviews really help. So if you're enjoying the show and you want to support us, Apple Podcasts, a number of the other apps also let you review podcasts now. So a nice review goes a long way. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook. That's facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory, and you can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. The theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
This is about something that lights your fire when nothing else will.
This is the Mark Divine Show. This show, we're going to discover and dive in and discuss what makes the world's most inspirational, compassionate, and resilient leaders so courageous.
Transform the nature and functioning of our own brain for the better.
Go put your virtues in action, be the best version of yourself.
Life is a practice, day by day, and get wiser and stronger and grow.
How do you understand enough about your own mind and psychology and emotions, and how do you develop a reflective awareness practice to actually get in the driver's seat of your own mind?
We go in depth with people from all walks of life. Martial arts grandmasters, meditative monks, CEOs, military leaders, stoic philosophers, proud survivors, and more. Every episode turns our guest experience into actionable insights that you can learn from to lead a life filled with compassion and courage.
I started putting all these little tools in my pocket, started to reflect a lot and meditate.
There has to be a balance between movement and rest.
It all starts with us. We cultivate these qualities in ourselves to become a beacon of light for others in the world. Please join us on the journey. The Mark Divine Show. Hoo-yah.